When we look at predictive project management in its entirety, there's a lot going on here. We're going to start with stakeholder engagement and communications. Why? Because they are the people that we are collecting requirements from. And we want to make sure that we're communicating effectively, distributing information effectively, and engaging the stakeholders so that we don't miss any requirements, which, perfect world, a lot of assumptions get made by stakeholders. So we want to do our best to make sure that we are engaging them effectively. Once we have a better idea as to who the stakeholders are and what this project looks like, we need to make sure we have the right people in place. So we're going to build a team. That sounds counterintuitive if you already have a team of people. So I want you to look at this like we're in a strong matrix. We have a core team that helps us plan. And then we add additional resources, cross-functional resources, contractors, whomever, to bulk out the team when it's go time, when it's their go time. So building a team, we acquire, we develop, we manage our team of humans. Then we get into scope. Scope is the driving factor of a predictive project. So there's a lot. We want to plan scope management. We want to, collect requirements. We want to document, create a scope statement and a work breakdown structure, get our baseline signed off on, because that baseline drives schedule and cost, but it also drives quality. Scope and quality are very tightly integrated, much like time and money. They go hand in hand. And so when we're collecting requirements for scope, we're also collecting requirements for quality. We want to make sure that it's fit for use, that it works, quality, and also meets the scope requirements. All of that has to be bubble wrapped. So we have to make sure that we're looking at threats and opportunities on the project level and integrate all of these plans together, get them approved so that we can begin to execute. As we begin to execute, we will be creating different artifacts. Those artifacts are things like lessons learned, issue logs, change logs. Do any of you use the term artifact to represent documentation that is created throughout the life cycle of a project and then stored in some kind of repository? Because artifact sounds like after the fact to me. Anyway, it's one of those buzz terms that's starting to pop up more often. But artifacts are documents that we create that can basically map out what we planned, what we did, where we went, and use that for historical information. Now, there are a ton of documents that we're going to be talking about, especially in predictive. I do have a document that I give out in my P&P class. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. It's a list of predictive artifacts and what they are, and a list of agile artifacts and what they are. Here we go. They're compartmentalized. Sometimes that's helpful for people because if you're taking notes, you're like, what's this? Or why is that an artifact? But that can help. It starts with predictive and some of the documents that we'll be talking about here. And it goes into agile so that you can take a look at the different agile artifacts when we get there. But this is the road that we're going to travel here for a little bit, because predictive project management is definitely document heavy, stakeholder heavy, interactions, communication heavy, and so on. So let's say we've got the charter in our hands and we're about to figure out who do we have to talk to. Now, PMI makes this sound like, oh yeah, you identify your stakeholders and you do that all up front, you're good to go. Well, people come and go on projects. Your stakeholders could come and go on your projects. And so this is the initiation. We've got the charter. We're going to identify stakeholders. We are initiating project work. And as things need to be updated with our stakeholders, we will update with our stakeholders. That's why it's an iterative process over and over and over again as people come and go. If you work with the same people all the time, that makes it a little bit easier to identify who they are. One of the big assumptions that PMI makes on this exam is that the predictive project is a year or longer and $1 million US or more. If you have that large of a project, there could be, definitely a bunch of stakeholders, maybe like 50 or 60 different stakeholders or more that are involved in the project that might not be immediately evident in the beginning. And they're going to have requirements that they want. So PMI looks at stakeholder engagement as a structured approach. How do we identify, prioritize our stakeholders, and then figure out how to engage them? Because engagement levels could change. In the very beginning, they might be like, I only need updates every 2 weeks. And in the middle of the project, they change that to every day. And so a lot of times stakeholder and communications will overlap. I mean, stakeholder engagement is using good communication to build relationships. Stakeholder satisfaction should be identified and managed. I want you to treat this like an iterative over and over and over again process. It could happen in planning. It could happen in execution. It could happen in monitoring and controlling. Life cycles, current stakeholders are no longer involved in the work. They could come and go. There are significant changes in the organization. So how many of you, let me ask you this. How many of you have a document or a distribution list or something that lists your stakeholders, who they are, what department they're in, what's their time zone if they're, if they're different, what's their preferred communication method, and maybe key requirements that they've asked for? Do any of you do that? A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't. International projects, I always did. I always had a stakeholder register, which we'll talk about. Basically a big old Excel spreadsheet that was color-coded. Who are they? Who's their manager? If they're the manager, what time zone they're in, that kind of thing, their preferred method of communication, so that I would make sure that whatever I was distributing or whomever I was interacting with, I would kind of know their story. You have a RACI, so responsible, accountable, consultant form. I hear that quite a bit. PMI separates the RACI and the stakeholder register. The RACI, they say, okay, well, this is, team and accountable, and we inform our stakeholders, but that's perfect. It's very similar. It's like, who are these people? The stakeholder register just takes it a step further because we're documenting a lot of different variables as necessary to collect the right requirements and engage who they are. And how are we doing? Are we doing a good job with that? I've missed requirements because I've missed stakeholders. I didn't know they were involved. Or stakeholders made an assumption about what we knew or what we were doing. And, welcome to project management. It's crazy. But who is our community of stakeholders? And how do we consult our stakeholders on a regular basis to make sure that they're engaged appropriately? And what's interesting is that this is prioritized, right? Because we collect requirements from stakeholders. We communicate with stakeholders. Stakeholders could be anybody. Our team are stakeholders. Our customer are stakeholders. So we have to tailor our interactions with stakeholders based on different things. They're people, right? So we adapt and adjust because people. Nothing will wreck a project faster than people. So when we look at the complexity of stakeholder relationships, if we look at our communication technology, if we look at stakeholder diversity, maybe we're international, those types of things can really affect. When we get to communication tomorrow, we'll talk more about some of the best practices for engaging stakeholders using communication, especially technology. Maybe we have virtual stakeholders, those kinds of things, and how we communicate with them on the individual and on the, team level, meetings, pushing out updates, documentation, and so on. So who are stakeholders? It's pretty generic terminology, right? In general, it's the person or group the project affects. Part of that could be internal stakeholders like the project sponsor. They could be internal or external like the customer. Our team are considered stakeholders. Functional managers that we might be borrowing resources from are certainly stakeholders because they're affected. Could be the project management office are stakeholders. These are just generic categories. Nothing that you need to memorize, like which of these are stakeholder. Anybody who has a stake in the project, has requirements and expectations, would need to, as far as PMI is concerned, be identified. Unless a functional manager is the voice of their functional department, you don't need to identify every single person on their team, but at least know who we go to talk to about requirements and updates. We might also have contracts in place. Contracts that have been signed during pre-project kickoff will have stakeholders listed. And if those contracts are already in place, not only do we have the stakeholders, but we have terms and conditions of those contractual agreements that we have to follow. So we want to be very clear and very careful about those stakeholders that are contractually bound to make sure that they're getting their incentives and that they're doing the work that they're supposed to do and so on. As contracts get signed, that can happen at any point in the project, and therefore stakeholders could come and go attached to contracts on the project and at any given time. So how do we identify all of our stakeholders? Well, PMI keeps this pretty generic, like questionnaires, surveys, brainstorming, brain writing, which is giving them the idea to brainstorm in advance so that they have time to kind of vet their thoughts and figure out who else might be involved. Brainstorming is what it is. You're going to see that with collection of requirements and all sorts of things. But face-to-face, virtual, Zoom calls, I mean, there's no wrong way to try and figure out who our stakeholders are. It's just what we don't want to do is miss stakeholders or misanalyze the stakeholders' influence and impact on the projects that we're working on. So we can identify stakeholders from any documents that have already been created, and we can begin to analyze those stakeholders who have already been identified to try and determine what they want, what information they need, and how they need that information. Here's the thing though, and we'll probably go through this tomorrow just because I don't want to start sort of a concept and be like, stop and wait till tomorrow. But there are some things that we're going to talk about in this section that I don't personally do on my projects. Everything that we talk about does not mean that's everything that you have to do. It's pick and choose. We get to pick and choose what's going to work best. I will do a stakeholder register. Absolutely. Document who they are, and we'll take a look at that tomorrow as well. I will document who they are, email, all that. What I won't do is start to classify stakeholders as supporters or distractors or detractors or resistant. Those are going to be things that I completely avoid. For me, that is a mental exercise only. It's not something that I'm going to put down in a document. And PMI, you'll see, will use letters to represent stakeholders. And I just feel like it's like to the nth degree. I get it. Stakeholders are important. We want to know what's their interest. What's their impact? Can they pull the plug? Are they in charge of funding? Are they a nightmare to deal with? Do they have knowledge that we need as subject matter experts? What is their contribution to project work? Is it valuable? Are these people that I need to invite to meetings and all of that? But just as far as this is concerned, you can let me know if you would do something like this. Let me know. But in essence, it's classifying current and desired stakeholder engagement. So C is current, and obviously desired is the future state. But we're not going to name who the stakeholders are. We're not going to say, oh, Jim is unaware. Unaware doesn't mean clueless human. I mean, it could, but in this case, it just means they're not aware that they're stakeholders or will become stakeholders. So for me, I'm like, it's kind of a waste of time to start documenting people that don't even know that they're going to be stakeholders yet. But would you use this and say somebody's resistant? I mean, we've all had stakeholders that are difficult to work with, that say no a lot, that are resistant. I just don't want to have a document laying around, because then your stakeholders might be saying, well, who's stakeholder number 2 then? Who's stakeholder number 3 then? I feel like this could create more conflict because somebody who is resistant might have a good reason for it. Yeah, we would love for them to get to the neutral category, which is the tweener between resistant and supportive. For sure, we want our stakeholders to be supportive. Not everybody's going to be, maybe in the beginning, but if things go sideways, they might become more resistant. I feel like as humans, as project managers, interactions and good communication and conflict resolution and all of those things come with this. I just think documenting somebody as resistant is not worth my time, in essence, because I kind of already know that mentally. Leading, if they are leading and should be leading, great. If they're leading and should not be leading, like a team member who's saying, oh, let's do it this way, everybody, and they do it that way because they have this, charismatic personality. But what we really want them to do is get back into supportive. Like I said, for me, this is typically not going to be an exercise that I'm going to go through, but it could be something that shows up on the exam. So when we come back tomorrow, we will pick up right here. We'll go forward with stakeholder registers and into communications, which is a fun topic, build the team, which is a fun topic, and then we start to get into the processes of scope, quality, schedule, budget, where it's really about the big constraints.